Hey guys, welcome back to the new Unfiltered. I had a really awesome talk last week in Detroit. I flew to Detroit to speak to a group of young people at the University of Michigan, which is actually in Ann Arbor. And I just got to LA last night. So that was really awesome. If you came to the University of Michigan talk last week, thank you so much. I really, truly had a pleasure meeting all of you. And 2024 is probably one of my biggest public speaking years. This is the most amount of talks I'll have done in a year from now until May and then again in October. So it's really a nice step for me to be able to talk to so many of you in real life. I've always been kind of a big advocate for getting off of the internet and getting in real life. And so that's what I'm able to do, whether I'm at a conference, whether I'm at a school, and it's just a really awesome opportunity for me. So before we get into this episode, make sure you subscribe to Stay Fearless or Die Trying. The show notes have everything you need to know about that. The reason I'm bringing this up in particular in this episode is because every single month with the premium subscription for Stay Fearless, you get access to an talk with a really incredible thought leader, whether that's a celebrity or an executive I worked with at Disney, whether that's someone who I've interviewed before. This is a one-on-one webinar style discussion where you get the chance to talk to these people directly, ask them your questions, and it's members only. So if you're a member and you can't make the talk, don't worry, we always send it out afterwards so you can re-listen. But this talk in particular was one of my favorites. And so I put together some of the snippets from John Hill. He's a former LinkedIn executive, and he's also a VP now at Techstars. And Techstars is one of the largest incubator style programs for startups. So we had a really awesome discussion about personal branding and investments. And so his wisdom is just super insightful. Now, if you are a premium member or interested in becoming a premium member, there will not be a podcast following every single webinar because that's not really the point of premium. It's really that ongoing monthly webinar that's private and personal for attendees. But that being said, I am a huge fan of John, and the wisdom he had was so awesome. So I thought it would be great to share that on today's episode. Next month, we're having on Sebastian Hidalgo. He is an actual Twitter branding expert, which is great because what I think is awesome about that discussion and why I'm keen to meet more members at that talk on, I think it's April 4th, is because Twitter is one of the ways that I have really scaled my business and built a solid community. And I think a lot of people overlook it. So head to the show notes again if you want more on the premium version of Stay Fearless or Die Trying.
Prior to Techstars, I worked at a little company most of you have heard before called LinkedIn. I was their higher education evangelist. I was infused in a higher education team, and we built products to support students, alumni, faculty, staff, institutions. Before that, I was actually in career services at Michigan State University. I was director of alumni career services, and then I was the internship developer, developing internship and experiential opportunities for 47,000 students. I actually started as a journalist, had a history minor. My dad used to say I was allergic to money. And I ended up sports editor for a national sports magazine, relatively young. Can you help us out? This is 1997. We need to start a website. And ended up hiring a programmer. We developed a website. And through that, realized that there were business opportunities and helped form a company supporting marketing, utilizing sports as the way to cut through the clutter. Developing it through online resources. So kind of a Web 1.0 company that was built. So very interesting nonlinear career path, but that's me in a nutshell.
Oh my gosh, John, thank you. So for Techstars, from the companies you've seen, I'm curious, what are you noticing right now in the startup space? Are there any trends, anything that you're noticing is really getting good amounts of funding, anything that isn't?
Yeah, so everybody is associated with AI at this point. And it's so fascinating because it used to be a vertical. You used to talk about things related to artificial intelligence and kind of their own little structure. And now it's moved towards a horizontal and sliced through every vertical. And that's a pretty seismic shift to witness because that doesn't happen very often. But anything associated with AI, obviously doing well. Space technology continues to be of interest. Interestingly enough, defense seems to be picking up speed recently. Climate tech, self-sustainability, those things are of interest. Circular economy definitely is something that, you see pop. Some of the things that aren't seeing the lift that they did before, one near and dear to my heart. I've spoken at 200 universities globally in person. I've spoken at 110 conferences in higher education in like 20 countries. Ed tech seems to be really taking a hit. And I think because it was overfunded during COVID, and now it's, you're getting the retraction. But yeah, very interesting.
Oh, that's interesting. Candace actually as well. She's in more of like the educational field. So I'm assuming you may have some questions from that element. But for those who are also interested in getting into the VC space, or they want to find a co-founder or are at the beginning of this entrepreneurial journey and they don't know where to go, do you think that Techstars or that kind of an accelerator program is the right step? Is there something else you should be doing first?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty big believer in an entrepreneur's ability to do their own kind of lift. And like one of the sayings that I absolutely love is entrepreneurs can exist without VC. VC can't exist without entrepreneurs. And I think all entrepreneurs should keep that in the back of their head as they're kind of negotiating how to build and scale their company. If you can do this without outside money, do it and continue to push as far as you can. What I also know is most founders are fallible. They have areas that they're not strong in. They obviously have areas where they are, or they wouldn't be able to get from 0 to 1 in lifting out a company. But if there are cities, if there are corporates, if there are accelerators, incubators, whatever, that can fill some of those buckets where you're weak, that's where it becomes advantageous. And that's where you start to lean into that direction. Personally, I think you should start local and connect with the people who are around you, and start to squeeze that as much as possible to get as much juice out and insight and understanding of how to navigate the entrepreneurial environments. Now, with our accelerators, there are actually 4 ways we tell people to build effective networks if they go through the accelerator. One is cross-connect with everybody in the accelerator. But if you remove that, the other 3 are applicable to anybody on the planet. So 1, you want to connect with people in your vertical because they can help speed up your understanding of what you need to do well. And then they can help you negotiate any roadblocks or, anything that's in front of you that will likely slow you down. So you can use that insight to support yourself. Connect within your geography and connect with entrepreneurs who are not in your space, in your geography, because you can utilize them as tree of trust. Being a founder is completely lonely. It can be mentally taxing. It's not an experience that most people do or should take. It's professional career on hard. And I know that from personal experience, and I know everybody here who's done it knows it, right? It is a difficult thing to do. You need those people to be able to talk to around you that you can commiserate with and get whatever's off your chest off to see, am I on the wrong path or the right path? Am I thinking about this wrong? Not, right? To help make some of the hard decisions. And if you're outside your vertical, you don't have to worry about signal at all with that group of people. And then the last one is to find the subject matter experts and the thought leaders. So again, go back to every founder is fallible, except for maybe Jillian and Candace, but every other founder is fallible. They have areas that they're imperfect in. There are people who are much better than all of us at HR or marketing or go-to-market or product development, right? And so if we can tap into those people, right, those 3 combined are how you build a very effective network in regard to building your startup.
Talking about loneliness is so intriguing because so many founders always say that they're so lonely. They don't have the community. They don't know where to meet those people. And that's where mentorship comes in quite often. So along the way, how have you found mentors? I mean, I would assume at LinkedIn, they were probably pretty mentor focused when you worked there, or no?
We're a mentor-driven accelerator, so that's where we lean in heavily. For everybody on this call, I was in charge of a large entrepreneurial network for a number of years, and there were five main reasons that, or there are five primary needs that all founders have that never changed. Number one was funding. Number two was talent. Number three was customer acquisition. Two and three would switch from time to time. Four was knowledge sharing. Five was mentorship, right? So everybody needs each one of those elements. And the sixth one that, I started noticing moving up the rungs, I think as people became more comfortable talking about it, was mental health. And, that how to fight loneliness in the process. And again, any founder who's trying to lift things off the ground, they're not working a 40-hour week. And that means that they're not giving themselves a lot of time to take care of themselves in the process. And it's up to this ecosystem. It's up to startups in general. It's up to accelerators. It's up to economic developers, anybody who's in this space, to make accommodations to support mental health as part of the process. But one of the ways, again, I go back to that third way or that second way to build an effective network, which is find founders to talk to. Mm-hmm. It's a good way to get things off your chest because those are people who understand exactly what you're going through. And the vast majority of people don't. Kauffman Foundation did a report on the amount of new start companies that happened in 2021. And this is any company. This isn't just tech. The new start rate for companies was 0.34%. So that means out of 100,000 people, only 340 people started a company that year. And that's any company, right? You are already a unicorn before you try to be a unicorn. Now, the challenge with being that is it, again, can be lonely. And so you've got to find the other unicorns to start to connect with.
And how do you do that? Aside from those networking events, do you think that these accelerator programs are the way to do it? I mean, and I know Techstars is a bit different than a YC, or even there's another one called Antler, but there's a very specific niche with Techstars as well, and the companies you guys have targeted.
Yeah. I don't think it's just accelerators. I think it's anybody who's supportive of entrepreneurs. I call them the helpers. There are helpers out there in every ecosystem, every environment. I've spoken and worked in entrepreneurial ecosystems in person in 40 countries. So I've seen this globally. There are people who will help anywhere in the world, a startup, because they appreciate who those people are, whether they were a startup to begin with, or they've worked in economic development, or they just like creative people. And there's no doubt that startups are creative because they suspend disbelief and do something that nobody else in the world has done, or do it better, right? And so in every one of the markets, there are the helpers, and they're usually easy to see because they connect a lot of different nodes together. If you connect with those people, if you identify those people, they'll usually plug you into where they think there are opportunities for you to engage and develop your network. It's interesting. I was speaking in Cincinnati, Ohio last week, and a PhD student from the University of Cincinnati came up to me and said, I have great ideas, but I don't know how to talk to people. And I'm like, you're talking to me right now. And, you're already doing the steps you need to do. I think we also need to give ourselves permission to be imperfect in the process of engaging and connecting with people. And one of the things that I think you'll see is this is how you network in a list. Just be organic, be authentic, tell people who you are and what you're about. Some people will lean in, some people won't, and that's okay. And then double down on the people who lean in.
It's wild how often people think, and I think a lot of that has to come with imposter syndrome. I'll have these calls, and I'm like, they're asking me a question. I'm like, you just answered the question, and they're like, oh, you're right. And I'm like, this is what's imposter syndrome, and this is what's very common for founders. Have you ever, I'm assuming, encountered it on your own or the founders you've worked with?
Yeah, no. I have imposter syndrome. Everybody does.
Everyone does.
There are moments where I'm on something like this. I'm like, how did I get here? Where did this pathway? I feel I don't even understand it, right? And then I sort of peel it back, and I realized, okay, I did build a lot of foundation that helped me take the steps to be in an environment like this. I put myself on thousands of stages. I've written more content than I ever would have thought that I could write. And then I lived what I represent, right? I help act as a vessel to connect people together with no expectation of return on anything. I just want to see what happens when two good people collide. And so, like when you do that again and again and again, and you do that over a course of 2 decades, you start to look back and you're like, okay, I understand how these steps work. But I was an evangelist at LinkedIn. I built the largest entrepreneurial network in the world. And I still catch myself saying, like, am I good enough to be here? Mm-hmm. And, at the end of the day, all of us have to step back and realize we're where we're supposed to be right now because we took the steps to get to that point.
Someone once said to me, where do you think the term, where do you think imposter syndrome came from? It's the term fake it till you make it, which has been thrown.
I don't like that term though.
Fake it till you make it or imposter?
Imposter syndrome, I totally lean into. The fake it until I make it, I think it's more important to tell people what you don't know, mm-hmm. which is not faking it.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you think I work with investors all the time, they know you don't know things. They know you get things wrong. Yeah. And if you come in and say, I know everything and I'm doing it well, that's not a good meeting. Mm-hmm. That's not going to go well. Right. And in fact, the best way to access capital is to ask for advice. And you ask for advice because you don't know everything. Mm-hmm. Right. And it starts to lead into you being qualified deal flow and getting funded on the back end. And so that term is one of the very few that will set me off saying it's not what entrepreneurs are because, at the end of the day, they're actually devaluing what they bring to the table. Every entrepreneur who's is starting to build something, they're already ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
They're ahead of corporates. They're ahead of venture because they're building something for 2 to 5 years from now.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. And by the way, that's your give for interactions with people when you're trying to take something back from them, which is, generally advice.
It actually leads me into an interesting point. And a lot of what I focus on with this newsletter and with my own social media is personal branding and helping founders really find their niche. And a common question I'm asked is, at what point are you an expert? Or someone I'm working with has been doing something for years and they're like, but I'm still not at this point, or I don't know that I'm right for this job. And I think that there is a timeline or an intuition of when you can become an expert and start selling those services as coaching or consulting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I also just like the term expert. So we've walked into 2 of my minefields.
I love that because not everyone saes that. So I love when somebody says something else.
So the other thing is, I was the lead product walkthrough specialist at LinkedIn. Arguably one of the best people in the world on helping people navigate LinkedIn as a platform and relational capital in general. And I would never call myself an expert. I just have a perspective that I can flip back to other people to help them learn for themselves and utilize a platform like that tactically. Mm-hmm. And so when people say expert, they're trying to separate themselves from other people. And I've always found that hard work is actually the way to do that. And being demonstrative and showcasing to people how they can help themselves or utilize something better or be more efficient or effective or whatever, right? And people will lean into that. I don't think you need to call yourself an expert, but I think people will believe that you are anyway because you're practicing what you're telling people and they're seeing that it's working for them. And so, again, it's maybe rhetoric. It's a way to kind of reframe things a little bit different. But when you say expert, you're saying you're better than others. And I think it's just a change. I think people just have a different perspective and maybe more experience, which is, different than expert.
One of the things I struggle with so much nowadays, though, with social media is you've got this group of people who I think would consider themselves an expert because they've amassed a certain amount of followers. And I think that's where my intrigue comes about personal branding and about actually knowing and being qualified to educate someone on a specific topic. Because just because you've amassed hundreds of millions of followers at some point or in a very short period doesn't necessarily mean that this person knows exactly what they're talking about. But that isn't something that's as common in the startup world. Is more influencing and content creation and personal branding.
Yeah, it's amazing the shift that happened around companies, specifically startups, in regard to personal branding. And by the way, I used to train people on effective personal brands when I was at Michigan State University in career services because we hit a recession and we had a ton of people who work in the automotive industry. And they had to rebrand themselves because they'd only built networks engagement in automotive. So all of a sudden they had to find jobs elsewhere, and they didn't know how to do it, and they had to like revision who they were to get there. So there are positives there. Like I think that that's a positive, especially in the job search, especially for entrepreneurs and startups who are not just utilizing it for a marketing play.
Yeah.
But the challenge, and I talk to audiences about this all the time right now for most startups, is it used to be you build a brand for your company, right? And that brand was what was important. Now you have to build a brand for your company and a brand for yourself. And so like that's a heavy lift, regardless of building the company, to try to do those two things effectively. There are some tricks that you can use. Like there's a philosophy called COPE, create once, publish everywhere. And the idea is you create a quintessential germ of whatever you're going to post on social, and then just shift it a little bit for each one of the mediums. Mm-hmm. The other one that I always tell people, the average person can remember about 4 things about you. So, like really bring it into the lanes of what you want to talk about on social. And if you stay the course on that, right, it's true to yourself, it's authentic. And people gravitate around that. And by the way, authenticity plays on this. If your role is, like, if what you're trying to do is become a creator, obviously you have a different approach. But if you're running a startup and you're trying to develop a personal brand in the space associated with your company, that's different, right? The angle on that is different. And I think what you want to do is focus on quality of relationships and people following you and connecting to you instead of quantity in that regard.
So do you think that every startup right now also needs to have a personal brand?
I think at this point, I think every founder probably does. Now the depth of that, I think, is would vary. Like if I'm a CTO, like I don't have to dig deeply into that. But if I'm a CEO, I probably have to have a thought process and approach that other people could potentially gravitate around.
I realized that. And when I launched this consulting firm, one of my services that I realized is a lot of these founders who have successful brands do not have the bandwidth because they're running their own company, right, to post on their LinkedIn and their own social media. So I added that in as a service because I realized that that is something that all these founders, even ones who have amassed multi-million-dollar companies, right? They still are like, I know I need to be doing this, but I don't have the time in the day. If you could choose the one platform for a founder who also has another company they're running, they can't do everything, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, what one would you suggest?
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer, Alexa, because I think it's dependent on the company that they're building. If you're doing something that's marketing oriented, if you're not leveraging things like TikTok, it's going to be viewed as, interesting. Like, I don't know. But, like personally, and obviously bias is attached to it, but where business takes place is LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And so, I think if you're looking at, and by the way, all the relationships that connect to your brand in that space are authentic. You can tell who they are. You can see their backgrounds, longitudinal career data. You can see their affiliations, right? And there are ways to mobilize that to support and help you out broader than that.
Yeah.
And so, like, if I were, LinkedIn's where business takes place, I would say TikTok, X, Snapchat are the water cooler of the past, right? It's where like an extreme of things that you're interested in right now happen. I would say, places like Facebook are like the bar. Good and bad conversations happen. And like, if I'm going to spend some time building out my company and my brand, I'm going to do it where business takes place. And I haven't worked at LinkedIn for decades. So like, this isn't a plug for LinkedIn specifically because of that. But like, it just seems like the best place to develop kind of that authentic voice that represents your brand.
I will also back you up on that. I mean, as like the influencer content thing that I've done for years with the personal brand successfully, LinkedIn is not only the place where I feel the safest in terms of like less anxiety, not feeling like jealousy or insecurity that I can see on Instagram, but you're right. It's where all the business takes place. It's where I've made some of the best connections. For me, Instagram is like people reaching out to me and then being able to connect with me as a brand, which I like. But LinkedIn is a place where I feel like I can get in front of mentors and other people and more successful people who I may be inspired by. So I'm a big advocate as well for LinkedIn newsletters. I think that every person should have a LinkedIn newsletter. And it's also simple to do if you're a founder. That's where a little chat GPT can come in there with your own kind of twist on it.
Yeah, I find it interesting that LinkedIn has leaned into the influencer tool sets.
Mm-hmm.
So, like they afford you the ability to do your own videos now. You can do podcasts off of it. Really, they've covered everything that you would need to build a brand off of it. And, at the end of the day, people have to realize the reason LinkedIn's doing that is they want more stickiness.
Yeah.
So they want people to spend more time on the platform. But if I'm going to spend time somewhere, I want to do it around professional content that makes me better as a company, as a CEO, as a founder, whatever, right? And so I find myself also consuming the most content off of LinkedIn right now, like I think depth of content. So like if I see an article, I'll jump into wherever that article is and read it. But I do that pretty heavily at this point.
Oh, that's interesting.
Probably for the last 10 years.
No, that's interesting. And it is interesting how it shifted because in ways that, TikTok is so short form content, there's no big takeaways. No one really watches anything, I think, and is like, okay, this is necessarily what they're buying immediately. It's so fast. But I find people on LinkedIn, and that's why I'm really keen on the newsletters, is it's similar to a podcast. If people listen to your podcast, they really want to hear from you. If they're reading this newsletter, they really want to see what you're writing. If it's a 20-second video, right? I mean, how you can't really retain too much from that. Are you even on TikTok? I know you're not a big Instagram guy.
Yeah, so I actually like Instagram, but I like it from kind of painting a narrative.
Yeah.
Like it's all imagery around Techstars right now. But I'm not TikTok. Not that I have any issues with TikTok. I don't. I mean, some of this is generational. Like I'm smack dab in the middle of Gen X. Like I just absorbed information a little bit differently. I watched my 17-year-old or my 18-year-old now apply social as a learning tool for himself on what's going on in the world in 10-second bites.
Yeah.
And like conversations we have are fascinating because his view is a little bit different than mine. But I look at how he's absorbed content, and I don't think it's any less valid than how I have.
Yeah.
He's just adopting it a little bit differently than what I would have learned from in the past. I don't know, like the social landscape is so interesting because again, I started as a journalist. So think back newspapers and magazines, you had 3 television stations, and how fragmented it is now is amazing. And again, I think huge challenge for startups and founders is where do you craft the right voice and how deep do you go and how much time do you spend on it outside of building a product and service, which is already one of the hardest things in the world to do, right? Yeah. And so like it's a layer upon layer. If I could tell for all the founders who listen to this, you are amazing. And if people aren't telling you you're amazing, I will tell you you are amazing because I realize how hard it is on what you do. And I would continue to dream big in whatever you're trying to build. Again, I go back to that earlier comment. There are helpers out there that would engage and support anybody who's listening to this. And so like lean in, reach out to those helpers. But it is interesting. It feels like things are getting harder for startups, not easier, because of the amount of things that are coming into them. Like add AI in and like literally now you have to be an expert on 3 or 4 things, not one, which means like I look back to when I built my company and it is almost nostalgic.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also 2 kind of different types of companies. And I think a lot of times this, and I don't know if it has to do with social media, but like startups and fundraising are such common buzzwords. So, and I mean, I lived in Austin, Texas for a while, which has become this hub for startups. And it was like left and right, everyone's trying to raise money. And if you're not trying to raise money, but why aren't you trying to raise money? But I think there's something really sweet about, number one, companies that do bootstrap. Not every company does better having raised millions of dollars. And tell me if I'm wrong, but like you don't necessarily, if you need the money, you need it, but you don't have to go into starting a company with the goal to raise because that's what so many of these other companies do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get access to government funding, non-dilutive funding, if you can win pitch competitions, take as much free money as possible. Yeah. But it is funny that you mentioned Austin. I'm going to switch just a little bit. I'm missing South by for the first time since, other than the COVID years, for the first time since like, I don't know, maybe 15 years. And, and I still think that there's huge value to in-person engagement and connection.
Oh, yeah.
And I think like people lean so hard into like technical ways to communicate with people. But the number one most effective way to communicate with people is still face-to-face.
Yeah.
That has never changed, right? And so like, and then second would be like this, Zoom to Zoom, Hangout to Hangout, phone to phone, right? But, like if you think about how we spend most of our time, it's through technology. So, like it's, email, SMS, direct messaging, LinkedIn InMail, right? Whatever. But those most important relationships, people should try to move into those first two buckets, the face-to-face, phone to phone. And when you're thinking about raising or not raising capital, one of the ways that you can figure out like which avenue to go and how to do it is by having face-to-face interactions and developing your most important relationships in those first two buckets. And, like it's tying everything we're just talking to back together. But I always go back to like, I'm a huge believer in the philosophy of building a network before you need it, so it's there when you do. And the most effective way to build a network is face-to-face. And so regardless of all this stuff we're talking about with personal branding and TikTok and, LinkedIn, at the end of the day, one of the reasons I wish I was at South by right now is because I'd be in person with some of the best relationships that I have over a 3-day period and reconnecting to create opportunities for the next year. And I think more startups, founders can do that regularly.
Yeah, huge agree. I've been going for the past few years, and actually last year in particular, I found to be the least amount of good connections and networking. And I talked to some other people who said that, and I was like, oh, it's interesting. But there is, community-wise, the events-wise, there's so many out there, and you never know just by going to one or, even participating in this kind of webinar, what can come from that. So you have to be fearless in that kind of a pursuit.
By the way, I want to say that like be fearless, I think is one of the most awesome statements that you could make. Oh. And I'll tell you why. I think most people operate out of fear. And that fear becomes an impediment to opportunity. And it's super difficult to pull down that fear. Deandra came in strong. But it's super difficult to eliminate fear in the process of what you're trying to do professionally or through networking or through group engagement or career choices or whatever. But your best opportunities come when you jump off cliffs, not literally, metaphorically, right? And so but the more that you jump off cliffs, the ground starts to rise up because it gets easier and easier because you jumped off that cliff the first time, right? And that first jump, that's all fear that you're facing. And so for every entrepreneur on here, kudos to you. You already jumped off a cliff. You're trying to build the plane before it hits the ground, right? But that, that next jump is easier and the next jump's easier, And so I love the title of your actions would be fearless. Alexa, it's awesome.
John, that means a lot to me. Thank you. It does resonate with a lot of people. And I appreciate that you say that because I find so many founders as well unfortunately, it's so hard to get out of your own way when you're doing this because you're right. You're building the plane literally as it is flying, as it is about to crash, as it is back in the air, and it's constant turbulence. And so I would love my last question for you before I open it up into a Q&A is for those who are really not sure about their next step or feel like they are dealing with standing in their own way because they're just too scared of the amount of ways that their idea or their company could go in direction wise. What advice would you have for them?
So you're saying, I'm scared about next steps for development of my company or scale of my company and stuff like that. So I will give you my view of true north because I think that everybody views support and advice to startups a little bit differently. But you can the best thing you can do is talk to your customer or potential customers as much as possible and let them help dictate where your product goes. Iteration of product, development, A/B test with them, bring them into the fold to become ambassadors for whatever you're developing. A lot of times people, I talked about Signal earlier, but a lot of people are worried about asking their networks for things because I think it signals that they don't know everything. And I already told you don't know everything, right? And so like be open to asking people for help in the process. Again, it goes back to the helpers, goes back to what we just talked about with jumping off cliffs. Like those helpers extend runway or they bring the ground up, make it a softer landing, right? But you've got to ask to get there. And I think like that's one of the biggest struggles is like people don't ask their customers what they want. They don't get enough insight. Whenever I see engineering first companies, I always like go, oh, because like you're not focused on what the people want. You're focused on what you think the people want, which are two different things. And so you can never go wrong if you lean into the people who are utilizing the products that you're trying to build. I mean, I'll give you an example of LinkedIn. We were building products to higher education. One of the things we were building were called university pages. So we tied all longitudinal career data to institutional attainment. We asked the universities what they wanted and literally brought them into the development phase. We did a closed beta for 6 months before we launched it live with like 200 universities. And like, you want to see if something works, do that. So like, again, I think you can never go wrong leaning into the customer voice. If all things are equal, that's the direction I would go.
Agreed. And there's also simple ways to do that. Like this doesn't mean that you need to have hour-long case studies. You can do an A/B, like a poll on Instagram. You can go back to past clients and ask them. And sometimes that can be a bit awkward and or intimidating because you never know what somebody's going to say. The best thing somebody's ever told me, like, I wish you had done this differently, or maybe you could have added this in, because you're probably not thinking about it.
The next part of the webinar goes into questions from the audience. Now, I don't want to put those in there because, like I said at the beginning, they were probably more personal and directed towards John. But I hope that you got as much insight as I did from him. I think that connecting with him on LinkedIn, if I was listening to this episode and wanted to get in the tech scene, I would 100% do that. I encourage all of you, regardless of where you meet me or hear me speak or who I interview, always connect with somebody after. It is wild to me how many people will listen to a podcast or be interviewed by someone or whatnot and then not even think to reach out to the guest. A short intro, you never know what can come from that. I'll give you a good example. I was in New York filming a few weeks ago. I ended up talking to somebody doing an interview in the street. He's a videographer. I had no idea, right? He gave me his business card. Long story short, it's now been a week. I fully hired him to fully produce this personal brand e-course, and I hired him for some other tasks. He even helped me edit this episode. And if I had never introduced myself to Adam, or vice versa, if Adam had said, no, I don't want to be interviewed in the street right now, that would never have happened, right? And I think that is one of the most beautiful things about life is you never know what's going to happen. And so that's why you always want to be prepared. So again, head to the show notes if you want to find out more about Premium. Stay fearless. And I will see all of you next week for the former CMO of Canada Goose on the show, Penny Brook. She is awesome. And this week in LA, I'm interviewing some of your favorite founders, from the founder of Mike's Hot Honey, Mike Kurtz, to the founder of Bluestone Lane, Nicholas Stone, to Shivani Howard. She's a lawyer. And oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be back in a studio and doing this. So I'll see you guys next week for a new episode of The New Unfiltered.